So I mentioned another key component of this program when I was talking about the innovations earlier. There's a particular issue with security in many of these areas where we work. It's improved a bit recently, but I think I explained that at the beginning of this program, there was a very small but evolving Maoist insurgency, is what it's called. These are basically anti-government political movements. The disagreements concerning governance in Nepal, they became very violent. We found that, as you can well imagine, the communities and areas that we were working previously, given that they were some of the poorest and least food secure areas of the country, that they were also caught in the middle of this Maoist insurgency. But we found that it was a very interesting dynamic that developed, that the communities valued very much the asset of the backbone asset that I mentioned, the road or the irrigation pond or the various programs that we had started there. And the dynamic that evolved is that although perhaps we as expatriate staff and even our local Nepali staff had limited access at times of extreme violence and given the security issues in some of these more remote areas, that still under their own local management these programs continued with minimum oversight from our part, which was a sign that we were successfully targeting the poorest households. We felt we had developed this reputation of this program for openness and transparency. The community ownership had been very well developed to the point where what we found, to our surprise, I might say, but also we were very much gratified, is that communities would sit with the Maoist commanders and explain that this was their program. This was not some outside central government program imposed on them. It was theirs. It was to their benefit. They understood it. They were implementing it. It was to improve their lot in life. And please don't interfere. For example, I've mentioned, I know, on the corruption issues and such, that diversion of food aid is a very common, unfortunately, very common occurrence in many countries around the world where we work. It's an asset with high value. Oftentimes, when food is used as a weapon and such, warring parties will see that food as a major advantage to feed their soldiers with, to deprive the population of that nourishment. Lots of dynamics that have to do with food being diverted and such. And of course it happened in this program as well, where we had porters who were portering food up to some of these high mountainous areas who were stopped by Maoists and then the food confiscated. The first time it happened, we thought, well, that's it. We're not going to be able to function here any longer. It'll be a shame, but obviously the food isn't getting to where it needs to get. The first time that it happened, and we made the point to all parties involved that this was unacceptable, of course, and that we would otherwise be forced to stop the program if the food wasn't returned within so many days. Lo and behold, one day I had a call from on the radio from one of our storekeepers at a small community warehouse at the base of one of the roadheads where the food was transported from, and all the food had been returned back to that little warehouse that he managed. And they called us on the radio and said, all that food that they stole from stole from the porters has been returned. And as we investigated and looked into it further, we had found out that the community further up, where that food was to be delivered, had met with the Maoist commanders and explained what I said earlier, that this is unacceptable. This is our program. You keep doing what you're doing in terms of your issues with the central government, but we need this, and you may not interfere. And what we found is that the Maoist commander stepped back and agreed to return all of the food. He was going to use the food to feed his soldiers, we would assume. But in the end, he realized that he needed community support for what they were trying to undertake in the region, and that without community support, it would be harder for them. So very interesting that this worked. And that I think is a lesson for sustainability, and also understanding that you are in an area where the need is greatest, and when push comes to shove, the community together in a united front will stand up and say, this is ours, this is important, don't interfere, let this happen. So as I've said, the poverty and insecurity aspects of vulnerability and food insecurity as well, that should be no coincidence to any of us. You compare this map to the previous maps that I showed you, and the high influenced areas of Maoist activity, which is a euphemistic way of saying that these are areas where the government simply did not go any longer, and these red areas were all under the complete control of the Maoist insurgents. These are some of the same areas, again, which are the most food insecure and the most inaccessible. And also our main, for our RCIW Food for Work program, the main operational areas of our program. And as I say, in many cases we were able to continue with minimal program revisions even during the Civil War. So RCIW alleviates poverty and reduces the underlying cause of conflicts we found. Because by having the communities more food secure, more invested in their longer term interests in being able to feed themselves, we found that they were better able to stand up when the political conflicts and the violence was developing and stay out of it. And also we found that when you have any types of insurgencies like this, which are rural area versus central government, which is not just Nepal but common in many countries where you have a huge gap between the have and the have-nots, as the underlying issues improve for the food security and access to food in this case, poverty is diminished somewhat. By definition, then, the underlying causes of that conflict could be reduced. This is what we found has happened in Nepal. So assets were then created that improve long-term food availability, the access to food. Once you have roads built in these far remote areas, when there is cash, when there is income there, markets will then penetrate. Traders will expend the extra time and effort to deliver food up to these areas so it can be purchased by the community. And this is a phenomenon that happens when development works, where there are income generating projects that work well, that people have cash in their pocket, they're able to buy food. Remember, we're in areas very high up now where there's food production, but very minimal levels. These people rarely will be able to produce all the food that they need. They'll always have a cash requirement in order to buy food. And once there's cash available in those communities, that will draw the market, that will draw the commercial traders up into their areas. And that was the importance of these microcredit programs, the micro projects, and skill development. So here's a great picture that I took as well, looking down on one of these roads. And now again, you may not think that looks like much of a road. Remember, many of these trails are not for vehicles and were never intended to. In this case, this is simply stone steps. And the stone steps, this is at a lower altitude now, where you can see there's vegetation and green. Yaks wouldn't be transporting in this area. It's too low. This is where donkeys take the place of what yaks would otherwise transport at these lower altitudes. And this is essentially steps. You can see shale stone steps that are built through the RCIW program. Engineers would come and help us design this again in a green way to minimize water damage and such. But it would have to be done with stones because given the high level of rainfall with monsoon, these trails otherwise would wash out every season. And indeed, in this case, this was a former trail that had been washed out, which is very, very, very common. And in order to sustain and make this a good manageable trail, you had to add in these stone steps. And this is very typically one of the key activities. So this has been a case study to kind of give you an idea, blow by blow, step by step, with all the different objectives and all the different concerns as to how a Food for Work program can make a difference in people's lives. In this case, some of the most remote areas of Nepal, where they otherwise would have very, very few options.